the big one, 9/11. I know that a lot of people think that if you question the official story of 9/11, it means that you are a tinfoil hat conspiracy nut. This must be a meeting of Boston 9/11 Truth, right? No. This is Francesco Cossiga, former Prime Minister of Italy, former President of Italy, and he said this: however, all the democratic areas of America and of Europe, with the Italian center front in the forefront, now know full well that the disastrous attack was planned and executed by the American CIA and Mossad with the help of the Zionist world to falsely incriminate Arabic countries and to persuade the Western powers to invade in Iraq and Afghanistan, end quote. And you can find that quote right in his Wikipedia biography. Here's a native New Englander who is a former air traffic controller, Robin Horton, and he said this, quote, I knew within hours of the attacks on 9/11/2001 that it was an inside job. Based on my 11-year experience as an FAA air traffic controller in the busy Northeast corridor, I state unequivocally there was absolutely no way that 4 large commercial airliners could have flown around off course for 30 to 60 minutes on 9/11 without being intercepted and shot completely out of the sky by our jet fighters, unless very highly placed people in our government and our military wanted it to happen. I'm going to play part of a clip from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and this is from YouTube.
I'm Dr. Bob Bowman, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. Flew 101 combat missions in Vietnam and directed all the DoD Star Wars programs under Presidents Ford and Carter. My PhD is in aeronautics and nuclear engineering from Caltech, and I did my postdoctoral work at the von Karman Institute in Brussels, Belgium, in finite element analysis. I taught at 5 colleges and universities, serving as department head and assistant dean. Finite element analysis is the solution of complex physical problems using advanced mathematics, things like turbulent flow or structural failure. I first became aware that there was a problem with the government's official conspiracy theory on 9/11 that very morning when I was watching what was happening on television, and my wife says I kept saying over and over, where are the interceptors? And then, of course, when the first of the towers actually started falling down, I just said, this can't happen. It can't happen. And then the other tower came down, and I said, this violates the laws of physics. It can't happen.
All right, let me stop that there. For people who doubt that credentialed people reject the official story of 9/11, I would encourage them to go to this website, patriotsquestion911.com, and you'll find hundreds and hundreds of statements by senior intelligence officials, military officials, law enforcement officials, government officials, engineers, architects, pilots who reject the official explanation of 9/11. I want to go back to a couple of things that Dr. Bob Bowman said. One is this violates the laws of physics. Now, when the Twin Towers were destroyed, there was nothing left except steel and dust. All the concrete, there were no chunks. It all turned to dust. Every piece of furniture turned to dust. Every toilet, every phone, every computer. There were about 10,000 metal filing cabinets in the World Trade Center, and they were all turned to dust except one, which survived, and it looked like a crumpled piece of aluminum foil. All the bodies were vaporized. You know, people would find, a finger bone here or a little piece of tissue there to do a DNA sample, but that was it. It's not possible to explain this as a simple rubble collapse, because there was no rubble. It's been estimated there should have been 12 stories of rubble, but it wasn't there. It all turned to dust. And if anyone thinks this is normal for a building collapse, I would just challenge them to find any other building in history that ever collapsed and everything inside became dust. It's never happened except on 9/11. And in case people were thinking, well, these are exceptionally tall buildings, so the tops would have pulverized the floors beneath them. Well, that still leaves us with the top floors. They should not have been pulverized. They should still have had rubble. as you would normally see in a collapse. Let's take a look at the North Tower exploding, and I want you to watch the plane holes there and notice that when the building, quote unquote, falls down, there's an enormous flash of flame.
That's great. Also, would you make everyone aware that we're going to be seeing some tape? Holy shit. Jesus.
Other evidence of the buildings being demolished was the fact that steel pieces of the World Trade Center that weighed multiple tons were flung laterally. They've been clocked as fast as 70 miles an hour, and some, like this one, embedded itself in the American Express building across the street. That won't happen with building collapse. Further proof of demolition comes from Building 7, which many of you, of course, are familiar with. This was part of the World Trade Center. It was the furthest building away from the Twin Towers, and later that day it perfectly collapsed. A 47-story building collapsing in 6.6 seconds. Now, the government's explanation for the Twin Towers was that they collapsed because of being hit by planes and then jet fuel melted or softened the steel. But you can't use that argument for Building 7 because it was never hit by a plane. Now, if you drop an object like a ball, laws of physics tell you that as the ball keeps dropping, it'll increase in speed. Well, scientists have actually measured the collapse of Building 7, and it actually increases in speed. In other words, nothing is holding it up at all. Now, the government tried to say that office fires caused the collapse, but many steel frame structures have had much bigger office fires and they didn't collapse. And if you want to try to argue that, okay, it was damaged by debris from the collapse of the Twin Towers, okay, maybe that would have affected the front facade of the building, but it would not have damaged the side or the back of the building, those columns, and there's no way it should have fallen into its own footprint. It was simply damaged in front, then you should have seen it collapse forward, not straight down into its own footprint, because asymmetrical damage does not cause a symmetrical collapse. Once you realize that the Twin Towers were demolished, you realize that that went way beyond the capacity of these guys. In fact, you think about it, in order to demolish the Twin Towers, the plane hits had to be guaranteed. And these guys couldn't guarantee that. So do you think that the architects of 9/11 planned it this way? Well, these 20-somethings that Osama bin Laden sent over, we hope that somehow they'll get into the locked cockpits. And if they do, we hope that somehow they'll take the controls away from the pilots, even though the pilots are bigger and most of them have military training. And then we hope that if they do get control of the planes, that even though none of them has ever been in a Boeing cockpit before, somehow they'll make perfect strikes. Because they did make perfect strikes. The width of the World Trade Center was 208 feet. The wingspan of a 767 is 156 feet. They really had to be accurate, and both planes just cocked their wings right before entry. You know, if you're a terrorist, you're about to face a fiery death. You're thinking about, let me get a perfect 10 on this hit. You know, I always want to, make sure this hit is perfect. It doesn't make sense. These planes hit with the accuracy of cruise missiles. I'm not saying, of course, that they were cruise missiles, but they hit with that type of accuracy, including the Pentagon. Now, I'm not going to play this clip, but I encourage you to go to YouTube and watch the video by pilots for 9/11 Truth called Airline Controllability. And they have an interview there with Dan Cavados, who is an FAA official, and he trains pilots. And after 9/11, he took 10 experienced jetliner pilots, and they said, guys, let's see if we can hit the Twin Towers. They couldn't do it. They got a simulator for a 737, which is much smaller and more maneuverable. They couldn't hit the Twin Towers. You know, the second plane, the one you always see hitting the South Tower, was going, according to the FAA, at 586 miles an hour. That is 172 miles above the maximum flying speed of a 767 at that altitude. And at that altitude, where the atmosphere is thicker, you have all kinds of forces, G-forces acting on the wings. It's very hard to control a plane at that altitude, at that speed. These pilots, these experienced Boeing pilots, who all had thousands of hours of experience flying jetliners, they all had to slow down to about landing speed, 180 to 200 miles per hour from 586 in order to hit the Twin Towers. So the idea that these amateurs who had never been in a Boeing cockpit in their lives could do it doesn't make a lot of sense. This is Hani Hanjour, who flew Flight 77 allegedly into the Pentagon. He wasn't allowed to rent a twin-engine Cessna because he couldn't control it at 75 miles per hour. He used to burst into tears during his flying lessons, and he couldn't even get a driver's license in this country for an automobile because his English was so poor on the written exam. Yet somehow we're supposed to believe that on 9/11 he became a super pilot. He hit the first floor of the Pentagon with such accuracy that he didn't even scuff the lawn. Now, somebody put this up on YouTube. It's a simulation of what Hanjo would have seen from the cockpit. Let's just play this. It's pretty short.
Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Too low, terrain. Too low, gear. Too low, terrain. Too low, gear. Too low, terrain. Too low, flaps. Too low, terrain. Pull up, terrain. Pull.
You know, 530 miles an hour is really fast. It's about almost 800 feet per second. So he's going 1,500 feet over the last 2 seconds. That's not much time under those conditions to give it this cruise missile accuracy that the plane had. Notice that the Pentagon is very hard to see. It doesn't come into view really until the last couple seconds, it seems, because it's flat. It's not tall like the World Trade Center. Well, the other question that Bob Bowman was asking was, where are the interceptors? A lot of protocols were violated in 9/11. It was standard procedure before 9/11 that if the air traffic controllers lost contact with it, or if it turned off its transponder, they were supposed to immediately contact the military. That didn't happen for 18 minutes on 9/11. And of course, you recall that there were pilots sent from Cape Cod, from Otis Air Force Base. Actually, it would have been nice if they had sent some pilots from McGuire Air Force Base, which is in northern New Jersey. They could have headed off the planes. Of course, everyone is being caught by surprise. But what really raises question marks is the attack on the Pentagon. If we look at the timeline here, at 8:46, the North Tower was struck. CNN was really quick to respond. At 8:49, they already picked up the story. At 8:54, the hijacking of Flight 77, which hit the Pentagon, began. And at 9:03, the South Tower was struck. So at 9:03, we knew we were at war. We knew that the first plane was no accident. Flight 77 didn't hit the Pentagon until 35 minutes later. Now, Otis Air Force Base is only 10 miles from the Pentagon. And so the question is, why was this allowed to happen? Why was Flight 77 allowed to be hijacked and fly for 44 minutes without anybody coming in to intercept it? And in case you think that nobody knew that this plane was coming in, I'm sure many of you have seen this testimony of Norman Mineta before the 9/11 Commission.
I wanted to focus just a moment on the Presidential Emergency Operating Center. You were there for a good part of the day. I think you were there with the Vice President. And we had that order given, I think it was by the President, that authorized the shooting down of commercial aircraft that were suspected to be controlled by terrorists. Were you there when that order was given?
No, I was not. I was made aware of it during the time that the airplane coming in to the Pentagon. There was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Well, at the time I didn't know what all that meant. And
the flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
Pentagon, yes.
Right. Now, we won't play the clips here, but we could also show clips of civilian air traffic control seeing the plane coming in. The head of the White House Secret Service, that they saw the plane coming in 50 miles out, 20 miles out. So the question is, where are the interceptors? Andrews Air Force Base did not respond to the World Trade Center attacks. It did not respond to the hijacking of Flight 77. It did not send up an interceptor until after the Pentagon had been hit, 10 miles from the Pentagon. If you would like to see a good video that refutes the official story of 9/11, I want to recommend this one, September 11th, the New Pearl Harbor, which can be watched on YouTube for free.